The first thing they saw was the fire cutting through the darkness. A lone Marine, burned and bleeding, dragged the heavy flamethrower across the black sand, while Japanese gunners poured fire into the bunker's narrow slit. When he fell, another Marine lifted the weapon without hesitation. Then a third, and a fourth. The weapons sputtered, roared back to life, and the bunker that had survived artillery, mortars, and machine guns finally disappeared behind a wall of flame. To the men inside, it felt less like facing soldiers and more like facing a tide that refused to break. Moments like this echoed across the Pacific. They left Japanese survivors asking the same question. How do you stop an enemy who will not stop himself, who accepts casualties not as tragedy, but as the price of reaching the next few yards of ground? This was not myth or American propaganda. These were the words of Japanese officers, extracted from diaries, interrogation rooms, and final battlefield messages, all trying to understand why the Marines fought as they did. Before the war ended, they reached a conclusion that reshaped everything they believed about courage, spirit, and survival. Long before the Marines landed on the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, their reputation had already begun spreading through Japanese intelligence briefings. Private Yamamoto first heard the name Marine whispered in a dimly lit room in 1943. The instructor, a staff officer who had interrogated captured Americans, spoke with an unease that was rare among the Imperial Army. He described a training system that shattered recruits mentally and physically, only to rebuild them into something far removed from the civilians who had stepped onto the parade ground. To Japanese soldiers raised on the code of Bushido, it felt uncomfortably familiar. But there was a difference that unsettled them. The Marines combined discipline and death before dishonor with the industrial weight of a modern superpower. This impression deepened as more reports flowed in from the front. The first major shock came on Guadalcanal, where Colonel Ichiki, a commander celebrated for his aggressive night attacks in China, led 900 hand-picked troops toward the American perimeter at the Tinian River. Japanese doctrine insisted that Americans feared the night, that they relied on firepower because they lacked spirit. But the Marines had prepared an ambush with machine guns, automatic weapons, and pre-registered artillery. When the Japanese stepped into the river at 0130, the darkness erupted with disciplined fire at point-blank range. Within 20 minutes, more than 700 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Marines lost 35. For those who survived, the lesson was immediate and chilling. The night no longer belonged to them. Even more unsettling was the realization that Marines fought not as individuals but as a unified mechanism. Interrogators recorded the words of a Marine prisoner explaining how boot camp erased everything civilian from a recruit's identity. For 4 weeks, instructors tore down every trace of softness, every assumption of comfort or retreat. Those who remained learned that surrender was not only forbidden but unthinkable. Then came the second phase. Recruits were rebuilt into Marines, taught that they were part of a lineage bound by duty, legacy, and the unspoken expectation that they would never fail one another. For Japanese analysts reading the transcript, it was a training philosophy that mirrored their own, yet carried out with precision, discipline, and a psychological intensity unfamiliar even to them. As word spread across garrisons, Marines became a subject of uneasy fascination. Reports from early engagements emphasized speed, aggression, and a refusal to delay attacks even when reinforcing units had not yet landed. Japanese officers, trained to conserve strength for decisive moments, found themselves confronting an adversary whose concept of acceptable casualties allowed them to advance where a rational commander would pull back. To troops stationed across the Pacific Islands, this meant that Marine assaults were not merely expected, they were inevitable. And with each engagement, the image of Marines as relentless, unbreakable shock troops took deeper root. By late 1943, the Japanese command understood that a new kind of enemy had entered the war. One who matched their will to die with an unwavering will to win. One who fought with both spirit and industry. And the war's opening chapters had only begun to reveal how far that combination would carry the Marines across the Pacific. Tarawa was where the Japanese understanding of the Marines shifted from rumor to reality. Rear Admiral Ki Shibasaki commanded more than 4,000 defenders behind fortifications he considered impregnable. When the first wave of Marines waded ashore under murderous crossfire, Hundreds died in the surf. The second wave piled up on the beach, cut down before they could clear the seawall. Yet the third wave kept coming. Flamethrowers ignited bunkers one after another, and Marines fought until either they fell or their targets did. In 76 hours, nearly 64,000 men were dead by Japanese accounting, and Shibasaki's fortress lay silent. Surviving Japanese soldiers described the attackers not as men, but as shock troops driven by a devotion to the objective that bordered on the fanatical. The next revelation came on Peleliu. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had studied earlier landings and built his defense around one assumption. American forces would pause after securing the beachhead. But on the 15th of September 1944, the Marines came ashore at 0830 and seized half the airfield by nightfall. Nakagawa's diary captured the collapse of his expectations. He had prepared for an enemy guided by logic, one who valued the conservation of strength. Instead, he faced troops who advanced relentlessly, regardless of casualties. Every Japanese fallback position bought only hours, never days. By the time October arrived, the 1st Marine Division had been bled so badly it had to be withdrawn. Yet the assault continued with fresh units, as if the losses of the previous weeks had meant nothing at all. Saipan brought another shock, one rooted not in firepower but in shattered doctrine. For decades, Japanese officers had believed that the fury of a massed banzai charge could break any defensive line. Colonel Takuya Takasha led nearly 3,000 men in a final assault on Marine positions just after 0300. Marines of the 27th Infantry Division were asleep when the attack struck, but they met it with point-blank artillery, machine guns, and bayonets. By dawn, bodies carpeted the terrain for hundreds of meters. Marine casualties were counted in the hundreds, Japanese losses in the thousands. Survivors admitted that the myth of American fear had been a lie. The Marines had fought them hand to hand and won. Other islands revealed something even more frightening. Marines had learned the tactics pioneered by the Raider battalions and applied them across the Corps. On Bougainville and Tinian, Japanese defenders discovered that the Americans fought 24 hours a day. Corporal Hideo Takahashi later wrote that there was no hour of safety, no chance to rest or rebuild. Against such pressure, Japanese endurance, once considered their greatest strength, became another vulnerability. By mid-1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Every island became a test of how long the defenders could endure before the Marines' combination of aggression, firepower, and logistics ground them down. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of a grim countdown. For the Marines, it was only the midpoint of a campaign that would push them toward the most brutal battlefield of the Pacific. The deeper Japanese analysts studied Marine operations, the more they realized they were facing a force that calculated battle in a way entirely foreign to their doctrine. Japanese commanders valued their soldiers' lives within the limits of accomplishing the mission. Marines viewed casualties as the price of accelerating victory. This difference created impossible dilemmas. To defend a position with too few men meant losing it quickly. To reinforce it meant weakening another sector. To abandon it meant conceding ground with no hope of recovery. The only variable left was time, and time was slipping away with every assault. Nowhere was this imbalance clearer than on Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood from the outset that he could not defeat the Marines. He could only delay them. He built a defensive system unlike any other in the Pacific, with 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 1,500 fighting positions. The beaches were pre-registered for artillery and mortars. Every approach was covered by interlocking fire. Yet on the 19th of February 1945, when naval bombardment failed to break the fortifications and Marines began landing in neat waves, something happened that no Japanese planner expected. Under perfectly coordinated shelling, the Marines advanced instead of pulling back. Even as the black volcanic sands swallowed their boots and the air filled with shrapnel, they pushed toward the interior. Within minutes, the beach was carpeted with dead and wounded. Bunkers that had survived days of bombardment poured fire into the landing zones. Japanese observers noted that entire platoons disappeared under artillery blasts. But they also watched something far more unsettling. When a flamethrower operator fell, another Marine picked up the weapon. When he was hit, a third continued the assault even while bleeding heavily. Demolition teams crawled forward until the bunker's entrance was reached and destroyed. This happened again and again in the first hour. For defenders trained to value honorable death, the site challenged everything they believed about battlefield logic. How do you stop an enemy who continues to attack even as half his number falls? The heavy casualties inflicted on the Marines were meant to halt their advance. Instead, those losses only triggered a vast logistical machine. Fresh units rotated forward while wounded men were evacuated within minutes to aid stations and hospital ships. Blood plasma, surgeons, and antibiotics saved men who would have died in any other army. Japanese soldiers, starving and dehydrated, watched Marines eating hot meals 3 days after landing, receiving ammunition by truck, and bathing in portable showers between rotations. Their own wounded died from infection, exposure, or lack of supplies. The contrast was more than tactical. It was existential. By late March, Kuribayashi had reached the conclusion he had avoided writing down until then. The Marines combined a willingness to die equal to Japan's, with resources that Japan could never match. Nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders were killed on Iwo Jima. Only a handful survived, most of them unconscious or too badly wounded to resist. The Marines suffered 26,000 casualties from 70,000 men, losses that would have shattered another army. Yet within weeks, their divisions were preparing for the next operation. For the Japanese high command, the implications were devastating. Courage alone could not overcome an enemy who possessed both spirit and industrial strength. For the United States, the performance of the Marines in the Central Pacific was more than a series of battlefield victories. It demonstrated that America's strategy of island stepping depended on a force capable of crossing beaches, seizing fortified terrain, and holding ground against counterattacks in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were not merely names on a map. They marked the stepping stones that allowed American bombers to reach Japan and brought the war ever closer to the home islands. Each battle carried a strategic weight that justified, in the minds of American planners, the terrible casualties the Marines endured. Inside the United States, these losses sparked debate. Newspapers carried photographs of the carnage on Tarawa, and families questioned whether such bloodshed had been necessary. Yet military leaders argued that Japan's island fortresses could not be reduced by air power alone. Someone had to land, clear the tunnels, and destroy the bunkers. The Marines accepted that burden, and in doing so shaped public understanding of what the Pacific War required. Their willingness to take objectives at extraordinary cost became part of the national narrative, a harsh reality tied to the broader goal of defeating Japan as quickly as possible. Globally, observers recognized that the battles in the Pacific were revealing a new form of warfare. Nations with industrial might could project force across oceans, sustain high-intensity combat indefinitely, and replace losses at a rate older empires could not imagine. The Marines embodied this transformation. They were not simply elite infantry. They were the sharp point of an industrial system capable of supplying ships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, medicine, and replacements at a scale unmatched in world history. To military analysts abroad, the message was clear. The age of spirit alone was over. Modern war belonged to those who could combine courage with logistics and technology. As the conflict neared its end, American leaders weighed the lessons of Tarawa and Iwo Jima while considering the possibility of an invasion of Japan itself. The casualty projections were staggering, shaped in part by the Marines' experience on smaller islands that had cost thousands of lives. These realities influenced strategic decisions at the highest level, contributing to the belief that ending the war quickly by any means might prevent losses on an unthinkable scale. In the aftermath, with the world looking toward reconstruction, the legacy of the Marines in the Pacific stood as both a testament to human endurance and a warning about the demands of industrial warfare. In the final months of the war, as Japan collapsed and its surviving soldiers returned home, a different truth emerged, one that had been hidden beneath years of propaganda. Men who had faced the Marines on Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima admitted that nearly everything they had been taught about their enemy had been wrong. The Americans were not soft. They were not afraid of hardship. And the Marines, in particular, had fought with a determination that matched Japanese spirit while being sustained by resources Japan could never hope to equal. For many veterans, this realization reshaped their understanding of the war and their place in it. The words of General Kuribayashi, written in the final days of Iwo Jima, captured this truth more clearly than any post-war testimony. He described the Marines as the finest soldiers he had encountered, noting their superior training, overwhelming firepower, and unshakable will to attack regardless of the cost. His final message to Tokyo was not a call for victory but a sober assessment of reality. Japan could not defeat an enemy who possessed both courage and the industrial strength to support it. For the defenders who died in the tunnels and ravines of Iwo Jima, this was not an abstraction. It was the final lesson of the war. In the decades that followed, historians and military analysts revisited these battles to understand why the Marine Corps had been so effective in the Pacific. Their conclusions echoed the voices of Japanese veterans. The Marines represented a fusion of spirit, discipline, technology, and national power. They embodied the promise and the peril of modern warfare, proving that courage alone is never enough, and that industrial might means little without soldiers capable of carrying it into battle. The Pacific Campaign stands today as a reminder that victory demands more than bravery. It demands systems, training, and leadership capable of sustaining that bravery over months and years. As we look back on these events, the reflections of those who fought offer a final measure of clarity. The Japanese soldiers who faced the Marines understood, often too late, that they had confronted an enemy unlike any other. An enemy who never stopped, never surrendered, and never yielded an objective once taken. Their stories, preserved in diaries and interrogation reports, deepen our understanding of the war and of the human cost etched into every island. What do you think carries the greatest lesson from the Pacific War, the courage of the individual soldier, or the vast machinery of industry that sustained him? Share your thoughts. And if you wish to explore more untold perspectives from the battlefield, join us for the next story.